Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. My name's Victoria, I'm part of Rethinking Economics, and we're really happy to be co-hosting this event with the Free Word. For those of you who don't know, Rethinking Economics is a network which started off as a network of students calling for reform in the way that economics is taught at universities, trying to bring about a discipline that is less abstract and more grounded in the real world, grounded in the way that we live our lives and the values that we hold. We've moved from curriculum reform now more and more into public education, as well as we saw that the problem with this discipline ranged actually beyond just the university classroom and into the way that economics is talked about in the media, in politics, and just the perceptions, and the perceptions that we all hold of this word. And I'm currently working on a project which is just called Economy. You can find us on ecnmy.org, which is economy without the O's. And it's all about just trying to take this word and turn it into just something that is really about how we all live our lives. And I think the reason why I'm personally really interested in this event is that this question of the growth imperative and what growth is, I think faces a lot of the same problems that the word economy and economics does, in that it's almost like a word that previously was just about the way we lead our lives has been co-opted into a term that is linked to all sorts of values that not everyone necessarily agrees with. And that's why we asked those of you who are here today to maybe share just your ideas of this word growth. So you'll all have had a card on your seats which has the question of what does growth mean to you? And I'd be really happy if perhaps before we go into the panel discussion, we could just hear some of your thoughts about what this word is before we talk about whether there's an alternative to it. What does it actually mean to us? I don't know if anyone would like to share, or perhaps if you take a minute to just talk to the person next to you, and then I will ask a couple of you to share, if you're willing, what this word means. So if you take a moment. Growth, just growth. I'm really sad to break this up now because you're all having really interesting conversations. But I'm really glad that started so much conversation. Can I ask maybe just 2 or 3 people to share, and then afterwards when we do the Q&A, a couple more of you could share your answers. Is anyone willing to volunteer?
For me, the primary meaning of it now is sort of an internal thing. It's personal development. It's what happens in here.
That's really interesting.
Well, we kind of said that we were talking about the opposite, which is that kind of relentless pressure on organisations to get bigger and to do more and to innovate and to always scale up.
Yeah.
That was the word we talked about.
That's really interesting. One more person, maybe?
Well, if you thinking of growth in terms of the natural world, primary example would be of a tree growing from being a seed to a sapling to a fully mature one, and then eventually sort of getting blasted by lightning and sickening and dying and becoming eaten up by the fungi.
Great. But I do think that's really interesting. We've just asked 3 people and had 3 completely different ideas of what this is, from the personal perspective to the kind of organizational perspective to just the natural perspective. So thank you, that's great, and hopefully we can hear some more of your ideas at the end. So our first speaker is not physically with us here today, but she is Joanne Yang. Joanne is one of the co-founders of the Rethinking Economics network that I'm part of, and she's also an active poet. And she's written a poem for us this evening, which is sort of her response to this question of what growth means. So we're all just going to hear that to start the evening off.
Good evening, Free Word Centre. My name's Joanne. I'm a writer, a poet, and a journalist. 3 years ago, I was also an organiser. I was one of the students who started up the community Rethinking Economics, which is an international movement to challenge and transform economics education in and outside of the university. I'm really glad that I have the chance to speak to you this evening because I'm actually 10,000 kilometres away in Hong Kong. I'm here with the Financial Times as their new China economics correspondent. I was asked to write about the topics of economic growth and the limits to growth, and so This is my poem titled On Growth. When you're 50, go wherever you like. The Chinese will be as rich as the Americans, and I'll be on my pension or dead, he said. I thanked him for the advice and left his office. I thought of how my children, maybe your children, would be born without that striving sense that life is better elsewhere in the West. I only want to go where you can grow too. All I want is a city you'd be old with me in. All I need is a bed. Imagine what humans would have done if the shade didn't draw us back daily. Imagine what lack of love would be left. When I'm 50, I'll have loved you for half of my life. My baby cousins will be getting married, and their mothers won't worry about the in-laws' salaries. We'll all be as rich as the Americans, and that's the end of that, I hope. We'll be as full as a monk who puts his mouth to the stream that flows ceaselessly. We'll be as complete as his closing his lips, licking the droplets, and taking his leave. May I grow to slake every thirst I possess, except for you. May life come as easily to our children as water to the lips. May they know when to dip their heads and when to lift.
So, to the panel that is here with us today, we're really excited about just the range of speakers that we have here. We're going to start with Kate Rayworth, who is Senior Visiting Research Associate at Oxford University's Environmental Change Institute. Kate is currently focusing on exploring the economic mindset that we need to challenge to address the 21st century's social and ecological challenges, and has a really interesting framework of her own with which to do that. So over to Kate.
Thank you. Okay, so Victoria asked everybody, how do you think about growth? And I'm just going to jump in and talk about how economists think about growth typically. Well, you know how economists think about growth. They think about economic growth, GDP growth. And GDP is the value of all goods and services sold in the economy in a year. Oh, it's not there yet. And if you look at this chart, which is about to appear, over time, it's grown exponentially. It's a very particular kind of growth. So over hundreds of years, first you see almost nothing happening, and then suddenly it took off, particularly around 1950 on the global scale. In fact, the global economy has quadrupled in size since around 1970 alone. That's the year I was born. So it's 4 times bigger in value from the year I was born. And if you believe mainstream predictions, it's going to be around 4 times bigger again by 2050. So, in fact, an economy that's growing 3% a year would double in size every 23 years. That's just how exponentials work. Now, the shape of that economy, Stuart has agreed not only to lend me a hand, he's going to lend me his arm for the evening. So could you just give me an exponential growth curve? No, that way. There we are. Right. That is beautiful sample of exponential growth, right? It just goes up and up and up and up. Anything that's growing at 3% or 5% is going to do that over time. And if Stuart's fingers were long enough, you know where they go right up through the ceiling, right? That shape, you can put it down for a moment, thank you. That shape actually is deeply comforting to us, because the shape of growth lies in our language. It's in our metaphors. Anyone who's raised a child knows that the most exciting thing that happens is they start to crawl. And first they go backwards, but then they go forwards. And then they crawl forward, and then they pull themselves up. So this sense of forward and up is deeply rooted in our sense of progress as humanity. And when you think of those little pictures you see of ourselves evolving from being apes to man, it's always a sort of crouched ape standing up to a man, walking forwards. So we have a very deeply rooted metaphor. And in fact, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson in 1980 did a wonderful book called Metaphors We Live By. And one of the primary orientational metaphors is that forward is good and up is good. So, you know, things are looking up, come on, onwards and upwards. So no wonder this picture of growth looks so natural to us. It's so compelling. But as the gentleman here said, nothing in nature grows forever. In fact, nothing that we can think of grows forever. So Stuart's arm was going up, but it would be quite weird if his fingers were that long to go through the ceiling. You'd be worried for him, right? My children, who are age 7, their feet are growing incredibly fast. Great. They're getting taller, but I really hope it stops, because otherwise, you know, they won't be able to sit at the kitchen table. Anything that is growing hopefully comes to a stop, otherwise it's deeply unnatural. And sometimes people say, cancer grows forever. Not even cancer grows forever. Cancer kills its host, and then that forces it to stop. In fact, everything comes to a halt. So let's have that lovely exponential curve again. There we are. So with a small flip of the hand, there's exponential growth, and with a small flip of the arm, this is what's called logistic growth. It grows, and it goes through this big growth phase, but then it plateaus. It levels off. And that's what the tree does. It grew from a little seed, shooting up through sapling, and then it matured. And of course, in the end, as the gentleman described, it died and went back, and it would come up again. This gentleman's personal development, thinking about our personal intellectual, it grows and then we plateau. The business that you work for, it's trying to scale up, but at some point, it's going to plateau. Everything reaches that plateau and then ultimately dies. So to me, a really interesting question that economists are far too scared to ask, can I have that lovely, where are we on this curve? In Britain, in China, in the United States, are we here? We always talk as if we're here, growth ahead. The politicians want the growth ahead. They talk as if we're down here and there's this great spurt to come. Technology, the digital revolution, we've got this great spurt to come. What happens if we're actually here? What happens if actually we're at the point where things are getting ready to plateau? If you look at if you look at the OECD's predictions, it sounds quite plateau. Growth prospects are very mediocre, 1%, sometimes 0%, very slow growth. So you can hear in language of governments, they're already starting to talk, they call it mediocre prospects, but it's basically very slow growth. Not yet ready to countenance that might be leading to what you'd call no growth. What happens if you have an economy that you don't actually know where you are on that curve, because we don't? You've got a real problem if you've got an economy that is getting ready to stop growing, but everything that's designed within that economy assumes it will always keep growing. And that is where I believe we are. I don't know that we're getting ready to stop growing, but if we're an economy that might come to stop growing, and yet it's been geared for about the past 80 years by the structure of business, by finance, by government, and by social expectations to expect, demand, and depend upon unending growth, then you've really got a problem. That's when you have governments that say we have to have trade liberalizations and cut back some of this so-called red tape. Actually, that red tape that opens up trade and increases exports and promotes growth, in other words, that red tape was once called workers' rights or environmental protection or health and safety standards. Or you can commodify and monetize the living world and create ecosystem services, and perhaps you can create bonds and trading in these areas, which I know Nick has thought a great deal about. So there is ways you can try and squeeze growth out of a system that doesn't seem to be growing otherwise, but we might think that those are ways that we don't want to live, and perhaps that system needs to learn to stop growing. So for me, a fundamental question or fundamental challenge is this: we have an economy now that needs to grow, whether or not that makes us thrive because of the way it's structured. But what we need is an economy that makes us thrive whether or not it's growing. So we've got an economy that needs to grow whether or not it makes us thrive. We need an economy that makes us thrive whether or not it's growing. And to me, one of the most exciting and challenging questions for 21st century economists is to think, what would it take to restructure business, finance, government, and society so that we could have an economy that allowed us to thrive whether or not it was growing? That's never really been asked before. I only know of Caroline Lucas, the Green MP, who's the only person who's ever willing, as a politician, to talk about the possibility of living in an economy that's not growing. No other politicians were willing to do it. And if any university graduate goes to work either in politics or in the media or in government or in business or in international institutions, you almost get on your name badge, you're for green growth, we're pro-growth, and there's almost no intellectual space for thinking about the need for an alternative. So we need to think about how could you have business that wasn't driven by shareholder maximization? How could you have finance that wasn't driven by having to have a positive interest rate? Could you have government that didn't have to grow forever to increase its tax revenues because it wanted to keep taxes low? Could you have a society that didn't expect increasing incomes and create its own consumer identity on consumerism, that we could take this growth drive out of all these structures that we've got? I believe it could be done, but it's a hell of a task. A real major challenge to the 21st century, and not something easy to say, dismiss growth and I'm all for degrowth. It's a huge challenge, just as challenging as trying to imagine an economy that could keep on growing and keep on growing. We're really caught in a paradigm shift moment between two different systems that it's very hard to imagine quite what either of them would look like successfully. And for me, one of the changes that we need to make is the way we envision progress. So that's the old vision of progress that we've had for the last, say, 80 years since GDP was first measured in the 1930s. So I'm trying to think of what would a new vision look like? How could we draw for ourselves, going back to the days when we were children, we looked at picture books and we looked at drawings and they deeply influenced us. I think they still deeply influence us. So I've tried to come up with another picture that could help us shift patterns. So if you could pop the second picture up. Okay, if you can see that. So that is not a rising line. That's a donut. I call it a donut, not because it's junk food. It might just be the one donut that's any good for us. On the outside, the eco donut. On the outside are what's called the 9 planetary boundaries created by a group of Earth system scientists who said, what are the critical Earth system processes that we need to protect if we're going to keep Earth in the stable, incredible stable state that it's been in for the last 10,000 years, giving us fresh air, fertile soil, clean water, a protective ozone layer, bountiful biodiversity. And they came up with these 9 planetary boundaries that we mustn't put so much pressure on that we kick the planet out of this stable state. And to that I added the inner circle, which are essentially critical human rights that every person in the world has a claim upon realizing. Many of them require resources: food, water, education, jobs, energy, being resilient with social equality and gender equality. So to me, the challenge for the 21st century is to bring ourselves into the green space of the donut so that nobody is left in the space in the middle of deprivation, but we don't go over the planetary boundaries into environmental degradation. Of course, at the moment, millions of people live in that space of deprivation in the middle, and we're way over many of those planetary boundaries of climate change, biodiversity, nitrogen and phosphorus use, and land system change. So we need to come into that space from both sides simultaneously. We have never done it before. So I draw pictures. I've realized that I find pictures very, very powerful as a means of communicating. You can tell I'm grabbing Stuart's arm and line. But I think it taps into something very deep in our heads. And I'm writing a book about this at the moment. It's called Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. And for each of those 7 ways, I think there's a real mind shift. And I'm so excited to be here tonight, but also in the future opportunities of working with verbal artists and visual artists. How can we draw and speak and poet and rhyme this new vision of a paradigm that we need to create?
Thanks very much. Thank you. So I'm really glad Kate has done half of Nick's introduction for me and that she's made that link between this economic model and just the literary, the visual, the artistic world. We're really happy to be joined by Nick today. Nick is a writer, a journalist and storyteller who writes about just the impact that climate change has on our cultures and our beliefs. So please go ahead.
One of the pointers I was given was to say a bit about what I feel the role of writers is in sparking conversation about alternatives to growth. And it made me think, well, first of all, it made me think how reluctant I am to speak about the role of writers in any given situation, partly because I can't pretend to speak for all of them. But also it made me realize that sometimes ascribing utilitarian roles for writing and art isn't very helpful. Auden had the line, "Poetry makes nothing happen." It's immensely frustrating for anyone that wants to see results. And growth is obsessed with results and things you can measure, things you can quantify, things you can write numbers about. It's impossible to measure or quantify the value of writing. It's mostly produced by people who have very little economic benefit to them through the act of doing it, as is all art. Often the economic benefit is just tangential. And often it doesn't produce any results at all. It isn't always useful. It doesn't always do a job, and that's kind of the point. I think talking about a possible role of writers, having said all that, it may not even be suggesting a concrete alternative, but I think one of the most important things that we as a group can do is to remind people continually that growth is a story, it's a narrative, it's a certain way of framing events. And what Kate was saying about that, that model of evolution, of like the kind of hobbling monkey developing into a big striding man, being deeply locked into our psyches, again, that's the story. It's a way of seeing history in progress. The idea of economic growth as being this kind of holy grail of a political objective isn't that old. It goes back to sometime after World War II. But it does follow on very perfectly, really, from other ideas that are deep in our heads. The narrative of perpetual Western industrial and technological progress, the myth of human progress itself, this idea, as Kate said, that we all started out as kind of blobs of slime, and then we developed to banging rocks together in a cave, and then one day we'll be living in the workers' paradise, or we will be uploading our consciousness onto the cloud and having ourselves replaced by nanobotic devices. Even the Big Bang itself is really a narrative of endless expansion. It's why we understand it. We start small and we get bigger. It's that simple. It's a very simple, linear A to B narrative. And in this way, that the story of economic growth can be told as if it's part of the natural order. It's just, it's programmed that things will get bigger. But it's good to be reminded that things also go backwards, and they go up and down, and they go round in circles. Again, Kate's image of the donut illustrates that really nicely. The narrative of unquestioned growth and expansion, what someone called relentless pressure a minute ago to get bigger. This has obviously become unstuck in many ways. A lot of people have stopped believing in this story. I grew up in the 90s with this idea that the EU was just this thing that was going to expand and expand. That seemed like the natural way of things, and that's clearly far from inevitable now. A few years ago, famously, there was a poll in the US that suggested that for the first time since the war, young people believed they would not be richer than their parents' generation, that they would grow up poorer. The Guardian's just been doing this whole series about millennials and how economically screwed they all are, unable to afford property or to get a pension. And this is a total reversal of the post-war narrative that we've all been brought up on of growth and progress. And it doesn't really matter whether it's true. There's many ways to spin these numbers. The point is that people have stopped believing it. This narrative is now in crisis. And this made me think of Donald Trump. I'm sorry I have to bring him up in a nice, pleasant evening. But it's completely understandable. The thing that really jumped out at one of his speeches that I forced myself to watch was, we're going to take and take and take and take. And to people that grew up with this narrative of perpetual progress, the dream, and then saw that narrative hit the wall of reality and realized that their country wasn't as big and as strong and as all-powerful as they thought, and that they were going to grow up poorer than their parents' generation. A guy standing up and basically saying, fuck reality, we can be the biggest, the best, the strongest, the greatest. That's such a simple appeal. Again, it's that A to B narrative, it's the Big Bang. We start small and we end up really, really, really big. It's a story totally stripped of any nuance and complexity and subtlety. And that's why it's such a powerful one to people that are angry and frustrated. But single stories are extremely dangerous things. I think it was John Michael Greer who said, never again will one story be told as if it's the only one. Telling different types of story is clearly very important, a refusal to believe in the lie that there's only one way of seeing the world. I want to just say something quickly about this short story that's been alluded to before. I'm going to read a very short section of. I was asked to write this for a Tipping Point commission last year. The story is called Green Bang, and I wanted to explore this narrative of growth, of the idea of natural capital. And for people that aren't familiar with that term, it's basically this totally neoliberal approach to the environment, to saving the world, that's being championed by a lot of people calling themselves eco-modernists or neo-greens. And basically every part of the natural world is seen in terms of its economic usefulness to humans, or specifically the human economy. So forests aren't forests anymore, they're carbon sinks. Pollinating insects become ecosystem service providers. You can buy derivatives like carbon credits and forest habitat credits and biodiversity credits and trade them just like any other asset on a free market. Again, this narrative goes right back through human history, which is why it's appealing to a lot of people. It's the same idea that has God giving man stewardship of the earth and putting man at the very top of the tree of life with everything else underneath him. This idea of valuing a mountain, not for its intrinsic mountainness, but as a piece of natural capital, an economic asset that has to justify its continued existence in terms of which services it provides to the human economy. It just seems so fundamentally and instinctively wrong. It's such a clearly psychopathic vision of the world that it was hard to know where to start. But the starting point was language, biodiversity offsetting, wetland banking, natural capital. I wanted to see what happened if I took that language and used it to build a world and then see how that world felt and how people interacted in that world. So it's set a very short time in the future when the narrative of natural capital has become the world's dominant story, the world's single story. The main character is an ex-ecosystem services trader who's had a breakdown of his marriage, he's had a personal breakdown, and he's trying very unsuccessfully to rekindle a relationship with his 9-year-old daughter. It was a warm autumn day, and the ecosystem service providers were buzzing in the natural capital. The foliage was consuming the light. Anders was sitting in his usual chair. Sophie and Sasha were on their way, and this afternoon he would go with Sasha to an area of outstanding natural beauty to forge a closer familial connection while recreationally walking. So they go for this recreational walk and attempt to forge a closer familial connection. And the father attempts to explain this new world to his daughter. Sasha, yes? Her solemnity grew, as if she sensed they were nearing that time, one of those adult conversations she'd probably learned to dread already. A siren whooped once far away. She sat there very still. There was a time before you were born when a tree was just a tree. That's all it was, just that. And it was the same for other things. A mountain, a waterfall, and a blade of grass were once just a mountain, a waterfall, and a blade of grass. A bee was once just a bee. There was no reason for them. She gazed at him with worried eyes. He knotted his hands on the picnic table and concentrated on the words, on simplifying the complexity. And even longer before you were born, before there were any bees or dinosaurs or single-celled organisms or anything else you might have heard about, the world itself, the planet we live on, that had no reason either. It was only a ball of minerals waiting for something to happen to it, for something to give it meaning. Then people came along, and for a long time they had no meaning either. They just happened to exist like all the other things. But eventually people learned how to value each other. And then they learned how to value the world around them, the trees, the waterfalls, the bees, the very planet they lived on. Everything was given a purpose that it didn't have before. Now, nothing exists for no reason. Everything is working together. It's a functioning part of a system that makes people happier. Of course, things go up and down. That's part of the natural cycle. You'll understand that someday. But the world has gained a kind of reason, just like people once did. Sasha, do you know what value is? It wasn't a question, and she didn't answer. It's another word for meaning. The higher the value, the higher the meaning. The meaning of the world is the value of the world, all its units added up, its leaves, its blades of grass, its reserves and its carbon sinks, its networks, systems, processes, everything together. Anders took a steadying breath. His hands felt rather far away, and something was happening to his eyes, a familiar throbbing. Sasha hadn't spoken, hadn't moved. Wind energy was stirring the trees, rustling the natural capital. Everything would be all right. Sasha, value is the same as love. How can we love what has no value? That is to say, what I mean, the phenomenon was occurring again. Water was coming from his eyes, turning the world into rainbow prisms, yet once again he did not feel sad. Instead, he felt quite elated. He wiped and snorted and managed to say, "I value you very much," before covering up his face and breathing wetly into his hands. He stayed that way for a while.
Thank you so much. So now we turn to Stuart, another speaker we're really excited to have here tonight. Stuart has been with the New Economics Foundation for a very long time and has worked in the World Bank and Rio Tinto and has just a wealth of experience talking about growth. You do. And I know that you've spoken a lot about values in your work, and this is something that has come up quite a lot, so it'd be really great to hear from you how you think that plays into this discussion.
If one goes, I'll come to values in a minute, but if one goes to the Museum of the History of Science in Florence, there's an amazing machine there, which was created either in the 13th or 14th century, which represents the solar system as people saw it then, and the Earth is at the center. And you crank a crank, and it shows you the orbit of Mars and Venus. And Venus goes something like that. And when you turn the crank, it's the most amazing bit of kit. But of course, it's total rubbish. It was all based on the idea that everything went round the Earth. And we are literally at a Galileo Copernicus moment now. We've got an economy, I think people have described it very well already, but I call it the 4 U's. It's fine, apart from it's unsustainable, it's unfair, it's unstable, and it's making far too many people unhappy. And a few other things as well. So I won't go into that. But critically, we need a major system shift. Kate's already referred to it, Nick's pointed to it as well, which requires a real rethinking, not just of economics, but of, I call it a values revolution. Because I think without a values revolution, we're not going to shift. We're not going to get, I can write beautiful essays about all the changes you need, but the big burning question is, how do these shifts happen? And when we look at shifts before in human history, whether it's the anti-slavery movement or the civil rights movement, or even the 2 big shifts in economic systems in the 20th century, first to Keynesianism with a much greater focus on the role of government and solidarity, and then to neoliberalism with much greater focus on the individual. You see really 3 things that are necessary in each of those cases. First, a compelling news story. It has to be a positive story, not just what's wrong with the old story. Secondly, that there's a vanguard or a movement of people across all sorts of different sectors who know things are wrong and prepared to work together. And thirdly, a values shift. And you've seen that in many cases. I mean, even in the neoliberals' case, there was the value of being pushed all the time, falsely, I think, but the value of liberty was the one being used. So we've got to talk in terms of a values revolution as well as an economics revolution. And I've been working with not the most usual body, a group of people from the World Economic Forum. They're not from, but they're drawn from all sorts of different backgrounds, different faiths, different nationalities. There's 20 of us, put together with the idea of saying, are there some common values we should be striving for? Or are they all culturally determined? And we came up with a very simple, when you looked at different civilizations, you looked at different faiths, there are very clearly some common values that we need to be striving for again. And the way we express them, there's many different ways of expressing them. They're very simply human dignity, and that's both rights and responsibilities. The idea that all our institutions should be working for the common good, and stewardship. Now, those sound all very fluffy and simple and obvious, but if you just designed an economic system around those, you would have to do something very different. You'd have to meet the basic needs, and those aren't just economic, they're psychological, security-wise, of every single human being on the planet. That human dignity demands that. You'd have to move from an anthropocentric view of the planet to a biocentric view. Stewardship, in effect, and living within ecological means demands that. You'd have to have a system that's much fairer, and you'd have to have as your key goal human flourishing or well-being, not the maximization of GDP or anything like that. Now, those values are very simple to say, but they require a major system shift in every way. But interestingly, when I talk, I keep thinking about various Davoses I've been to, I'm going to be asked to leave after them, because I'm always talking about how we need to, do an economic revolution and all the different. But sometimes I get through to people, sometimes not. The stuff on well-being translates very well. But when we talk to people about values, it's very interesting. That resonates almost with everybody. And then when you actually get to talking about what they're doing, and is that commitment to their values, what you often see is a lot of people actually, even people you think who are very powerful, actually feel trapped by the system they're in. And that's why we need the type of people you got here. We need people across all sorts of walks of life helping imagine a new story, and why we need a movement for change where instead of playing our own instruments as we need to do to all sorts of different scores in lots of different orchestras, we need some common scores. And we've got to find, and that's part of a value shift as well. So the imagining, as Kate says, we don't know what this world is going to be. I can give you some of the building blocks, but we don't actually know. We've got to imagine it and find out. But I think we know the goals, and I think we know, which are some of those things I've said. We know some of the values that need to be there. We know some of the principles. And if we could operate at that level and create the new institutions we need, create the new vision, create a really positive, compelling vision, because, I've gone on for a long time telling everybody how they're, if we carry on with climate change, thing, we're going to be fried, burnt, crisped, etc. But it doesn't actually take you very far, It's sort of, so it's actually creating a positive vision of a world, and we haven't found the right language yet, and language is terribly important, and this again is something we need to work on together. I sometimes talk about good lives that don't cost the earth, but that still doesn't quite do it. But we have to find a compelling new language to sum up this world that we're living to, and to inspire people. And enough of us who know that things are wrong and want to change it have to start working together. So we've got to break out of, I come from civil society background, so I've worked for Oxfam before, New Economics Foundation, then business and World Bank way back. But we have to find not just, civil society. When you look at the more progressive movement, we're often speaking with dissonant voices. We're focused too much on policies, not enough on values and principles. But we need to be working with the cultural sector. We need to be working with faith groups that believe that. We need to be working with research and policy people, with academic. We've got to find people who know things on whatever sectors they work in have got to come together. It's absolutely crucial. The New Economics Foundation's been working on something called New Economy Organisers Network, but that's just one bit of the picture. So my fundamental thing is we need a values revolution, we need a new story, and we've got to work together. And there's lots of things that will change. We need probably a basic income for every human being. We need to rethink the global commons. We need to rethink work. We've focused, so much on labor productivity. We don't want the Chicago Symphony Orchestra to be more productive. I don't want who cares for me in my old age to be more productive. I want more, So we've got to rethink the whole picture. I mean, it's as big as that. It's as exciting as that, but it's scary stuff. But can we do it? Yes, we can.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So we'll all leave tonight with quite a big to-do list, but I hope you're all ready to take that challenge. So our last but not least, we're going to hear from Johanna Nijman. We're really glad to have Johanna here as a really amazing young voice, and that she's the president of the European Youth Forum and currently works at the Environmental Justice Foundation here in London. Thanks, Johanna.
Thank you very much for having me. So I'm going to take over where you left it. We need to rethink this whole system, and we have to look ourselves in the mirror. And what we see right now in Europe, but also across the Atlantic, it's fear. A lot of people are governed by fear. And I think this fear, it comes from the unsustainable development that our societies have been going through. A lot of empty promises that people see is not really delivered on. Promises that we don't actually get something out of. And this gives the space to fear. And who follows in the steps of fear, I think we have seen them in a lot of countries across Europe, but also in the US at this moment. And it's not the future I want to see. And I think many of you agree with me on that. I think the first step, what we have to do in order to combat fear, is come up with this narrative, this positive story of saying, where do we want to go? But to be able to do that, we have to see things for what they really are. And I think it's important not only to talk in the big ideas sphere, but to really see the things for what they are. And when it comes to environment, we know the state of the climate, we know that our resources are ending, but we have to see what are the concrete stories that we can pick up, and what are the things that are really happening out there. One very concrete thing is the fish are disappearing. We're overfishing. I'm originally from Finland, and the Baltic Sea, first the fish started to shrink, and now they start to disappear. We've been fishing too much and polluting too much. It's happening to a greater scale also out in the big seas. So, for example, outside of Thailand, the fish have been decreasing by 86% since the 60s. So it's not even that many years, but we've been fishing it away and shipping it off, mostly of it going to Europe and to the US. And what happens when there's no fish, but there's a very big demand for consumption and an even bigger demand for lower prices, is that there is a lot of human abuse in the other end of the scale, meaning the people who are fishing those fish are severely abused, a lot of forced bonded slave labor, human rights abuses. And that is the reality coming from our growth and our excessive consumption. The second thing is climate change. We all know what's happening, but we don't stop. The government in the country where I come from, Finland, just took a decision to, in order to enlarge our economy, they want to start digging up and burning all the peat in the country, meaning destroying the local ecosystems, but also meaning releasing even more carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, creating more global warming. So this is the reality of what is happening. And when it comes to young people and our possibilities, you already mentioned it. You saw probably in The Guardian, Generation Y and our prospects. In Europe right now, we had 23% of young people being unemployed with no prospects. No future. I meet a lot of young people who are angry, but even more young people who are apathetic, sad, saying, why should I try if there are no possibilities? We'll never have the possibility of buying a house. That is a utopia. The good thing is if you can actually land a job, and if you get a job, what kind of job is it? It's not something you would call a quality job. It's unpaid internships, it's shitty working hours, it's 0-hour contracts, and the possibilities to actually have some kind of stability and to then think about the next steps of building your life, maybe having a family, having a stable future is not really there. So this is the reality, and then we have to ask ourselves, how does this relate to growth? Well, many times when we talk about youth unemployment, for example, the promises we get is growth, and this will create jobs. And this is the way also our generation will be a part of the well-being we have had in Europe this far. For young people, we also have at the moment a lot of migrants coming to Europe, refugees knocking on the door to Europe, and they are not let in because there is a fear that we have too little to share, which is not the reality. We have a lot to share, but there needs to be a genuine will to redistribute between generations and between groups in society. And this will is lacking at the moment, and I think a narrative should be built also around this, about the values of sharing and caring about each other. So the question is, how can our generation get access to the welfare without growth? And that is a very difficult question. The easy answer is, let's go upwards. More. And just to round up, the question is also about Europe, because here right now it's a very heated debate. It's interesting to follow it also as a European. I cannot vote in the upcoming referendum, but of course eagerly following the discussion. And I think Europe is very important, not because of the pensions or because of the visas or because of the economic growth, but Europe is important because we share values. And Europe is a way of cooperating across borders, because I don't think we solve the question of economic growth or sustainability by sitting in a village somewhere and making a collective decision. We have to reach out and we have to make a decision amongst as many people as possible, because that is how we can truly change the reality we live in. So it's identifying our values and making sure that as many people as possible share those and work for those collectively.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just another round of applause for all of our speakers. And Stuart, do you have to?
I have to go, sadly.
Okay,
I'd love to
unfortunately. Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, so now's the time to open up the conversation. I think we've had a lot of questions raised here and a lot of ideas shared, and I know that some of you had some more thoughts perhaps just about this idea of growth. I think we can probably agree on this side here that there does need to be an alternative to the growth imperative, and I'd be really interested to just hear what your ideas on that might be, as well as any questions you have for the panel. So does anyone have anything they'd like to share? Yeah, here.
Thank you. So sort of restructuring a whole system away from growth, will that also require restructuring or slow down in growth in other areas like human population?
Kate?
Yes, yes, I think it does. I think, so people are frightened of talking about population. It's a really tense subject, because the minute you start talking about whether or not it matters how big the population is, if you don't talk about it, people think you're completely ignoring it. And if you talk about it, people think you want to control their families. So it's very tricky. The way I think about it is this, and if I had Stuart's arm here, I would show you all over his arm. See, population is doing exactly this. If you look at the global human population, it's been through an extraordinary growth spurt, but it is coming to a plateau. Of course, it matters where it comes to that plateau, whether it plateaus at 9 billion or 10 billion or 11 billion, but it's coming to a plateau. And the brilliant thing about it is that in the past, when if you saw a graph of when human population the rate had gone up and down, in the past, the times when the population growth rate slowed, it was always due to disaster. Chinese famine, post-World War, global epidemics. For the first time in human history, the global population is slowing down and coming to a halt due to success. And the great success is girls' education, child's health, women's empowerment, women's access to contraception, women's empowerment in jobs. It essentially means that women have been able to take control of their bodies, their children are surviving, and when a woman can take control of her own family, scale that out, the global population starts to slow down, and people prefer to have 2 children rather than large families. So for me, I really agree that population matters. And I think people should stop being afraid to talk about it. It matters, but it's not the one that keeps me awake at night because it's doing this. The one that keeps me awake at night is GDP growth, because it's still doing this. It's on an exponential curve where the population's plateauing due to the natural forces of humans succeeding, thank goodness. But we need to, but when a population is still growing, and people wanting to move into Europe, of course there are pressures for the economy to keep growing. Otherwise, you're sharing a fixed resource between more people. And in fact, when populations do grow, the economy grows because you're bringing in something called labor, this extraordinary resource that gets to work. So a growing population tends to make the economy grow. It's another reason why we should think of a slower growth economy, because in countries where population is slowing down, there's fewer new bodies coming in as workers, it's going to slow the economic growth rate down too.
I think from all the panel, it seems that there is an alternative to the growth imperative. But as Nick said, when you look at somebody like Trump at the moment, you have an absolutely linear narrative which says growth, growth, growth. And that has been something that, for most of us, has informed our thinking since we were small. You know, the idea is to go from that crawl to the walk, is to get bigger, is all of those things. How do we change that narrative? How do we move from trying to convince people that actually more isn't better to actually accepting that if we want the world to be a better place, then we are going to have to accept that less is better?
Yeah.
Yeah, just something that just jumped out at me is the idea of growth of what? That's what we need to we could have growth of empathy, growth of kindness, growth of sharing, growth of redistribution. We just got this, everyone's got this idea in their heads that growth is just getting richer. And I think it is, there's cracks in the story. Increasingly in recent, there's books about like affluenza and kind of things that actually look at, like Stuart said, unhappiness. If this narrative works, why are people in rich societies unhappy? That shouldn't happen according to this theory. That doesn't make sense according to the narrative. And I think this is causing people to question. So I guess the only kind of solution I can think of is allowing the space for these questions and different types of story to emerge. I don't think it necessarily takes 10 or 20 visionary geniuses to be putting out these ideas. I think people already have these questions in their heads. People are probably starting to retell their own stories. So more encouragement of that.
Yeah,
that's one thing.
If I can just abuse my position as chair for 1 second. I think just the really interesting question you asked there is just how do you create a new narrative, right? And I think just from the perspective of rethinking economics, I know that a large part of the reason why I joined this student movement was because when I studied economics at university, just on like the second, third lesson that I had, we were looking at just the assumptions of neoclassical economics, which is the kind of economic school of thought that you learn the most about in a typical economics degree. And you're sort of made to memorize just a couple of assumptions that you need before you can move on to the more complex theory. And one of those assumptions is more is better. And it's like, in the first week of your education to learn about the economy and economics and what it means to be an economist, you learn to rely on this assumption of more is better. And it's why we're so passionate about this idea of changing education, because as you say, we're not even looking for something so radically different. People already have their own ideas of a new story, and it's just about saying what should grow. As you say, it doesn't necessarily have to be just material growth and things getting bigger. It could be growth in so many other things, and people already have these opinions, but we just need to change the way that it's talked about. And I know that from a rethinking economics perspective, a large part of that is just changing the way that we educate economists so that the narrative around the economy can just become about something else. I don't know if you wanted to add.
Yeah, maybe adding not only educating economists, but how we are all brought up by each other and by society. I mean, when I went to school,